Okay. Hi, everybody, and welcome. This is part one of two events for military families with children with autism. I am Crystal Voss Mahaney with Partners in Promise, here with our lead researcher, Jenna, Dr. Jenna Kremkow. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm absolutely thrilled to bring what you have to say and share to our Partners in Promise audience. So today I want to talk about the what, the why, and the how of research. All right, Dr. Kremko, please say hello to our audience.
Hey everybody, good to be here. As Crystal said, my name is Dr. Jennifer Kremkow, and I'm an associate professor of communication science and disorders at Elmhurst University. And most of my research career has been studying military families with autistic children. And I also do work for Partners in Promise as the lead researcher, just like Crystal said.
Awesome. Well, I so appreciate you being here and sharing all of your wealth and years of experience. Um, so let's just kick it off with a question. Why did you start studying autism?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have like an excellent answer for that. I just kind of fell into it, to be honest. Autism was one of those things that I heard about in undergraduate school, and it was, part of a series of different, disorders and disabilities that was discussed as part of my training. And then when I got to graduate school, I was assigned to a research advisor who studied autism. And the more I got to learn about it, the more I just found it so fascinating that, these individuals are just so completely different from each other, that there's so many strengths that they bring to the table. There's some challenges too, and just kind of the differences between them was just super, super fascinating. And so I just kind of happened into it, and then I just loved it. I loved learning about it. I loved working with autistic individuals, and I guess here we are.
Yeah.
So, how do speech language pathologists work with autistic individuals? We work with them in a variety of different ways. As speech language pathologists, we are, communication specialists. And so we really know all of the ins and outs of communication, all the ins and outs of, social interaction, the ins and outs of what's called communication partner training. So how to like work with parents and teachers and other people and how to accept different types of communication from a variety of individuals. And so that's really where kind of speech language pathologists work within. We work with several different individuals all the way from, birth throughout the entire lifespan. And autism is one of those categories of individuals that we work with to help figure out, what are some different ways that this individual person communicates best? How can we help them capitalize on those ways that they communicate, whether that's through speech, through actions, through like the use of a computer or pictures or something like that? How can we help them communicate their best? And then how can we help other people understand their communication best? And we work in a variety of settings, hospitals, schools, private practice, to try to capitalize on those strengths and help others recognize those strengths as well.
Thank you for explaining that. For those of you that don't know, my oldest son Jackson he is autistic. He was first diagnosed with apraxia just before his third birthday, and he had no words. And I mean no words, not mom, not mama. He babbled normally. He played normally. There were no red flags that I had until I was at a playgroup, a mommy and I don't know, playgroup setting. And he was jumping on the trampoline, and another mom came over with her son and he wanted to jump. And so started counting, you have 10 more jumps, and started counting. And she prompted him to count with her. And I said, yeah, he's not going to do that. And she kind of turned, she goes, well, how old is he? And I said, 2.5, lied through my teeth, 2.5. And and she just kind of, oh, it was the first time that anyone had really, I mean, a stranger, because all my friends were like, oh, he'll talk when he's ready to talk, and it's fine. Boys always talk later. And so And I never wanted to be that mom that fit their kids into like a, a cookie cutter. This has got to happen and whatever. And, but also no red flags from his pediatrician. I filled out all those forms at all of his well baby visits. No one ever said anything. So I knew he didn't talk, but that was the first moment that I broke down in tears in the parking lot because I just, okay, this is clearly something I need to address. So I took him to a developmental pediatrician and she diagnosed him with apraxia. So thankfully, I had a very good friend who was a speech language pathologist that lived at Fort Carson with us, and she showed me, she taught me, she translated for me. So we started speech therapy, and he started with sign language right away, and I thought that was
Mm-hmm.
fantastic. Well, then the behaviors there was things that I just knew that okay, I don't have this tool in my toolbox as a parent to be able to address something else is going on. And it was kind of by happenstance that someone had suggested, or I don't know, I was scouring the internet for more information. And of course, autism popped up. And I just thought, I mean, it could be. What if it is? And, mentally, I sort of prepared for that and just exploring that option and see if this could be a possibility, which I was not against whatsoever. But I didn't really know where to go, and I didn't really know kind of the authority of who to believe, except for Google and my friends who were moms. And so, I very much appreciate you explaining that because communication was so important. That was my main motivator, was helping him to communicate because I couldn't and I didn't know how to teach him that. And then it was about 6 months later, he was received an autism diagnosis. And I was thrilled in the sense because I knew I had more direction of what to get him. And we're going to talk about this in a little bit about how families pursue therapeutic interventions for our children. But I just wanted to share a little bit about my journey and how it started and why I'm personally interested in the communication disorders and how they relate to autism and how important that is. Because as you explained, communication is key. And I just am really thankful that professionals like you exist to help not only parents help to communicate with their child, but helping the child communicate with the rest of the world, which is what we want them to eventually do.
Yeah, and that's a very common experience that of parents who I've talked to who have autistic children is that, they start out and it seems like everything is going along just fine, but communication is delayed and they're not really sure like at what point should kids start to say their first words or put words together because unless you've been trained in that, like you don't really have a reason to know that information. And so communication is very often the first things that parents notice that just isn't coming along as like younger siblings come along or cousins or friends, play groups. And so, yeah, it's very often one of the first signs for parents of like, oh, something might not be as I expected here. And, maybe there's a reason why my child is not yet talking other than a potential delay.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
That's super interesting. Okay, so next question I'm going to throw you. Why or how did you start researching the military population?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I had decided to continue on for my PhD because I really loved research. I loved being curious and getting to ask questions and try to find the answers and try to make life better for people. In my case, since I researched autism, make the lives of autistic individuals better. And so right before I started my PhD, my advisor suggested, spend some time in the research literature, look around, see what kind of gaps are there, and get a sense of what you might want to research, like when you actually start in the fall. And I just so happened to have a conversation with a friend who's a military spouse, and she was talking about how challenging it was for her to get physical therapy appointments at their installation because they were in the middle of nowhere, as some installations are.
Yeah.
Um, and the only thing that was close was on base, and the appointments on base were for service members. And so she's like, I have a problem with my knee. I really need to get it rehabbed, and I can't get an appointment anywhere. or I have to travel an hour and a half to a civilian provider. And so, as part of this conversation, it just got me thinking, you're having trouble as a military spouse getting one appointment. Autistic individuals usually have many different people that they work with, whether it's school, medical, therapy, or otherwise. And so, how much more challenging would it be if you were a military family, you had a child with autism, and you had to find six different therapies or six different professionals in like the middle of nowhere? And how would you go about doing that? And so it just kind of got me thinking that must be really hard. I wonder if there's anything out there that provides support to these families, or maybe all these questions have already been answered. I don't know. So I looked through the peer-reviewed literature, and there was really nothing out there
Mm.
for military families who have children with autism. And so I was like, well, if there's nothing in the peer-reviewed literature, we don't have anything to help inform policy for like what's best to support these families. And we also don't have anything for best practice for clinicians, educators, or medical professionals for how to best support these families either. And so I was like, okay, well, there's nothing in the literature. Is there anything out there that would suggest that there's a need? Because it could be that maybe there just isn't a need for this research and that's why it's not there. So I consulted Dr. Google, um,
Like you,
and at like one does. And I was finding blogs from military spouses who had autistic children saying it was really challenging, saying there was very little support, saying how difficult it was like to move all the time and to have the service member here and then not here, and like how that transition was really difficult. And so it's like, well, it seems like there's a need here. There's no research here though. And so let's look into it. Like, let's figure out what is the experience of military families with children with autism to see what do they see as some of the barriers? What do they see as some things that would be supportive for their experience, and try to like move the needle, try to like make their experience more positive by providing ideas for supports from a policy perspective and also from like a clinical practice perspective. So that's really kind of how I got started, was just by happenstance, but it worked out really well.
well, and it sounds like it sort of started with just a genuine curiosity, which I
Mm-hmm.
appreciate. One of the things that when I talk about you is that our lead researcher doesn't have a direct military connection.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if it's just our community. We're just really thankful for that because you're an outsider looking in and you have such an incredible perspective of what our life is that you know you can understand it because you study it and you ask the best questions, by the way. You must know that, but it's really interesting and important for, I think, military families to know and to hear that you're genuinely curious and you genuinely want to help, like you said, move the needle to make it better for our families. So I just want to thank you for that. For our audience, we will, Dr. Kremkow has written quite a few papers about the military experience with families who have children with autism. So we're going to provide those, but I wanted to highlight one, your 2018 paper. 2 points I wanted to make is that the military community we're pretty tight knit and we're siloed quite a bit. So when it's a military family who is also part of the autism community, you recognize that we're in two communities all at once. Can you talk about that just a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. So as you know, I started my kind of research experience in autism only, and so I was very well aware of some of the challenges that parents of autistic children reported kind of throughout their lifespan, mostly with kids in terms of like special education services and feeling like they really wanted like more support or different support, the challenges that they had with getting a diagnosis and how like often those services were delayed because there was a huge wait list, right? And so I was aware of all of that literature. And then I learned about the military culture, and kind of, the resilience that's built in, all of the potential stressors of military families, like the relocation and the deployments and temporary separations if the spouse goes on, or if the service member has different types of like missions where they're gone. And so I learned about that. And then, when I was interviewing the military spouses with children with autism, like I found that they were talking about both of these problems, like both of these communities and some of the challenges that go with them together. Like it was always, we relocate all the time as a military family, which is challenging because you need to like pack and unpack and find things like the grocery store and just get used to being in a new place. But also, like, we have all of this other, like, autism related challenge too of helping our child, like, kind of accommodate to a new setting and helping them set a new routine, helping that, or, finding therapies for them, being stuck on wait lists. And it's just like every 2 or 3 years, the families had like, kind of, um, had this like melding of these two challenges for both of these communities that just made it really stressful. And so that's where I kind of describe you're part of these two communities, but when you have a time of high stress like a relocation, it's like the challenges of those two communities are just exacerbated and come together because you have both sets of challenges every 2 or 3 years when you relocate. And so, yeah, that's kind of what many spouses described to me as being challenging to
Well,
communities, but the
yeah,
problem kind of comes together at certain circumstances and makes it very stressful.
very so. And I have to say, I love that the second point I wanted to make on the paper was that you identify that our baseline stress is higher than civilians, which I think that most of my military mom friends who have kids with autism would, yeah, yeah, our baseline stress is higher. Um, One of the things that I think is interesting too in the military community. So my husband's been in 22 years now. My son is now 13. And so we have moved, let's see, one, two, three, four, five. This is our fifth relocation with a child with autism. And we are PCSing summer of 2026. And he's excited about it. I don't know. I very much appreciate, I don't know why he is, but I very much appreciate that he is like up for it. He's still very limited verbally. We have a tough time with back and forth conversations. So we're working again to get him an AAC device in the school setting, but he is excited to move and he'll get on my phone and he'll look at the weather of our next duty station and he'll look at, he knows that there's a Legoland in New York and he finds these things that he gets excited about. And that's such a relief for me too. Um, because like you pointed out, every time we move and every time we relocate, it's like, okay, now I got to figure out all of these things for him, getting him set up with the therapies. And I'll be honest, right now we're in Savannah, Georgia. When we PCSed here 3 years ago, it was right before the summer, and I just said, I'm not doing it. We're not doing therapy this summer. We're not doing speech. We're not pursuing OT, ABA. I'm not doing it. And I think it was it was hard on the one hand, because I had this sense of, but what if this is going to hinder his progress? What if this isn't a good decision for him? But I also felt really okay with it because it felt like a good decision for our family because he's still a kid and he did years of intense therapy, years of intense therapy and school at the same time. So I felt it was okay and important. And so if there's any families out there listening, I just want you to know it's okay to make that decision. It feels weird in the moment because you struggle with the guilt, but it is totally okay. And like doing well. I don't think there's so much that was missed in those 2 months of taking the summer off that, he's not progressed somewhere exponential from where he is right now. So it has to be okay.
Yeah,
Um,
it's sometimes you just need to do something for your sanity too. Like there's so many just logistical challenges with moving. And it's, most of my moves, I have moved a couple times, like to different states. My most recent move was just like, to a further north city of Chicago. Um, but, there's just so many logistical things that have to happen. Sometimes it's okay just to take a break, and to recognize that, maybe what's best for the family unit is for me to be like a little less stressed so that we can establish like life. And then we can worry about some of those other things.
and that makes me think maybe it's a good time to kind of reset too. And
Hmm.
maybe we need to reestablish where our family baseline is, because when we're in the therapies and we're doing the things and we're always thinking about progress and we're always thinking about the next, maybe it's good to kind of take a step back, to take a break and say, okay, where are we now? What do we need? What does he need? What do our children need? What does our family need now? So taking that step back and having that moment can be really positive for the family.
Yeah. Some nice
Um,
reflection.
yes, yes. So one of the things that your research talks about is the effects that relocations have on children, and you bring up the external and the internal. Can you tell our audience a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Yeah. So as part of, one of my very early projects was interviewing military spouses with children with autism. And I asked very open-ended questions, just like, what was your experience? Like, what was it like to move? What was it like to have your military or like have your spouse deployed? And the information that parents were offering, I found kind of fell into multiple buckets. And one of those buckets that the information fell into about this experience, was like the effects on the family and the end effects on the child with autism in particular. And so what families were reporting were that, in these great times of higher stress, especially relocations, their autistic children were experiencing more what I called like external behaviors. So things that you would like more likely to physically see, right? So maybe regression in certain skills that they had developed or had like at the duty station they were in, but then they weren't doing it at this new place. More challenging behaviors, so like more acting out, um, more aggression. That's something a lot of parents mention too, which is more aggressive at home, more aggressive at school. And then there was also this kind of theme of more internal behaviors as well. So things like expressions of anxiety or depression, greater stress. And so, the parents kind of talked about how they felt that like these kind of additional behaviors, both external and internal, were related to the stress of moving, and kind of needing to reestablish all of the relationships that the child had had with their different providers, with friends and peers, and some of them talked about how they thought it was also related to like the delays in services that they were experiencing or being on wait lists and not having services, not having a set routine. And so those are some of the things that, the spouses reported as being challenges or difficulties, that they saw in their children as they relocated from installation to.
Really interesting, because I remember when he was 4, 5 when we first moved, when we first PCS, and yeah, the challenges that he had then were very different than they are now at 13. One of our colleagues here, Partners in Promise, Brittany Summers, she'll be on part 2, by the way. She she asked a question. We were having a discussion about our kids with autism, and she said, "Well, is it developmentally appropriate?" And that was like a lightning rod for me, because we're so used to interpreting all of their behaviors as autism or all of their challenges as autism. And it was just, let's answer that question first. Is this developmentally appropriate? And then answer the question is, could this be autism? Or is this related to autism? All right, Jenna, next big question. What is research?
That is a really good question. Um, so I think when someone mentions research, I think there's kind of two things that someone might think about. The first is doing research on their own, right? So doing consumer research or trying to find out information about something. Like if you're buying a new TV, you might like look up different features that are available, different brands, different prices, and then you take that information, go to the store, and make the best decision possible. Or like I tend to be an organizer and a planner, and so when my husband and I would be planning like a trip overseas for vacation, I would read like books on that country and figure out what are the best recommendations and make an itinerary, right? So there's like that kind of research that's mainly just for the person doing it, or maybe if you're buying a gift for someone, it's like it's for them, right? But it's more personal. And then there's scientific research, which is very, very carefully planned, systematic way of finding new information or learning something more about a topic. And it's different from kind of the consumer research in that scientific research is really based on the information that came before it. So researchers look at, what's been done, what do we know, and what are the gaps, what do we not know, and how can we try to address those gaps, and how can we address those gaps in such a way that makes life better for people, right? That's kind of the ultimate goal of research. Scientific research is like researchers want to make life better in whatever area they work in, right? So if you work in medicine, you want to make life better by developing different drugs or medicines or surgery techniques or like patient communication, protocols, right? If you work in an area like mine in communication science and disorders or speech pathology, you might look at what are some new ways we can design AAC systems to make them easier to operate? What are ways that we can better communicate with families to make sure that the client is seen and heard, and making sure that the family's values are really like intertwined in intervention, right? So like the way that research improves lives is different depending on the topic, but that's really the ultimate goal. Researchers don't do research for themselves. They do research to make life better for everybody. And so, one way they kind of go about doing that is by looking at what's been done before, where are the gaps, how can I address those gaps, how can I design a study that's scientifically sound, that's going to collect the data I want to collect, that's ethically sound, that treats participants with respect, that allows them to like take themselves out of the study if they don't want to be in it anymore, that makes sure that their information is protected, that no one else knows that they're involved in the study, but like me, the researcher, or my research team. And then, they take the findings, they report them out as like in what's called the results section of just kind of like straight data. Here's what the data are, right? Here's what the data say. And then they take that data and they put it into context with what's been done before. And not just like confirming what's been done, but like what's similar to what has been done before, what's different or new, or what contradicts what's been done before, and then what are plausible solutions or explanations for those things that are new, different, or the same. And then how can we take that information, that data that we just gathered, and how do we make recommendations, right? What are recommendations for policy? What are recommendations for clinical practice, for best practice? What are some other gaps that we still need to answer? And so, that's really what I would say scientific research is. It's a carefully planned, systematic way of answering questions to make life better for people.
Awesome. That's an incredible explanation. I think, Partners in Promise, we've done research, we've done surveys for the last few years, and I've been part of the research teams, but I've never been part of the survey development like I am now. We're on a research team together, and I'm learning so much. But I think it's important for the audience to understand just answering that question, what is research? What's the point of it? Why is research, why does Partners in Promise do research? Well, because we want to learn about our community. And what we know is there's those gaps of information about our community, about the military families, that we would like to fill that void. So let's talk a little bit about the four main sections, if you would.
Of course, yeah. So I mentioned that, researchers don't do research for themselves. They do research for like the betterment of people and then to share it, right? As part of that sharing, there's really two main ways, there are many other ways, but two main ways that researchers usually share that information. And that's through peer-reviewed research articles and conference proceedings, which are often also peer-reviewed. As part of that process, there's four sections of information that researchers talk about, like either in a presentation or in a paper. The first section is what's called the literature review, and that is just a section of the paper or the conference presentation that provides historical context for what's been studied. So the researcher looks at, what do we know from other research about this particular topic? What do we not know about this topic? And then what are some of the gaps I think that as a researcher need to be filled in order to like make progress in this area? So that's kind of like a summary of what would be in this section. And then researchers provide a paragraph that describes, okay, here's what we know, here's what we don't, and here's how I'm going to try to address that. Right? That's the first section. The second section is called the method or the methodology. And this section tends to be pretty dense because it's a lot of like researchy lingo about what the researcher did. So it's information about what research design was used, how do researchers find the participants, how did they develop whatever they did, right? So like the questions of a survey or interview, how did they develop the intervention package that they put together? So, how did they develop what they did? And then what data are the researchers going to get? How are they going to analyze that data? And how are they going to make sure that that data are reliable or trustworthy? So like I said, it tends to be fairly dense. But the idea here is that it needs to be detailed enough that another researcher who's not associated with that research team could just take that method, that methodology, replicate it, and it come out with the same results. And so like, yeah, so like part of research is not just having one paper that says X, we believe X causes Y. Like that's great, but we don't take that as fact until there's multiple papers. So it's like you're kind of building this building to make a case for why something needs to change, and each paper is like a brick in that building. And so you wouldn't say you had a building if you just had one brick. Well, we don't say that something is evidence-based practice until there's multiple bricks, right? And so, a researcher being able to take a method and replicate it is really, really important in the research field. And so like that methodology section is part 2. Part 3 is the results, and that is a description of what the researcher found from their data collection and analysis. It's usually fairly straightforward. There's usually like tables, quotes, graphs of the data, but it's strictly like, what did the researcher find? And then the discussion section is where the researcher puts those results into context. So they describe, how is this information similar to what's been done before, what previous research would say has occurred? How is this information new or different or contrary to previous research? What are some plausible explanations for why it's similar, different, or contrary? And then what can we do about it? Right? So, okay, now that we have this information, we've given the context for it. What are some recommendations we can come up with, right? So, how do we, what are some policy recommendations we have for this information? What's something we can do clinically that would be different that we think would address these issues that we found in this paper? Um, what are some other things that make sense based on what we just found? And then, there's also a section of this area that talks about future directions. So what should researchers consider moving forward? What can researchers do to continue to move the needle on this topic? And then what are limitations? And so every researcher who does research knows that no study is ever perfect. It doesn't matter if it's like the highest quality study, there's something that could have been better. And so in the limitations section, the researchers talk about, here are my challenges with the study, here are the gaps in my study, and here's what someone else needs to do to try to fix those gaps. So those are kind of like the main sections of a paper and also the main sections of a presentation a researcher would give on their data.
I find that so interesting because I mean you're putting how you're doing, why you're doing it, how you're doing it, what you did, and then what could have gone better. So
Mm-hmm.
that tells me there's a tremendous amount of self-reflection in the entire process, that it's acknowledging, hey, here's how this survey was limited to this degree. And because I think like the average Joe or Jane has this sort of abstract idea of what research is, and that it's this I mean, it is grand, and but it's, you present it that it's very carefully thought out, that it is very intentional, and it's really systematic in order, at least trusted research and reliable data, like how thorough it is. That's pretty intense.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yeah.
very,
Yeah, it is very intense. And I think like one of the challenges with, your average Joe, average Jane, and understanding research is that the research papers themselves are written mostly for researchers, and so they're very dense and they feel very like ivory tower-ish, but that's not the goal. Like we have to write them that way so that other researchers can take it and like replicate it.
yeah.
But the goal is not for that information to stay in ivory towers. The goal was to get it down to everybody else, to make sure that like the research I do related to military families with children with autism gets to people who can change the policy and gets to people who can like take the recommendations and think about how can I use this in my practice as a speech pathologist. And so like that to improve the lives of individuals, right? And so like that's really what it's meant for, even though it feels very separated from that, just because the writing can be so dense.
It's a little nerdy. It
It
is,
it's real nerdy. Yes.
but I like it.
Yes.
So and it's funny. So, and my work is in the law. And what's really interesting is we have case law, and case law is that historical context of any given subject. And then we take into account, when I teach my students at GW, they have to take a fact pattern and analyze the previous law, how courts have previously decided on similar situations. And they
Mm-hmm.
have to analyze how that situation, how the court might rule in that situation, and would it be the same? Would it be different? This is really interesting. And lawmakers use that to improve policies and to improve
Mm-hmm.
the law and to improve um, how the law interacts and intersects in people's lives. So I just had to draw that parallel.
Yeah, yeah, it is very similar in that kind of that idea of what's been done before, how does that apply or not apply now based on this situation, and then what can we do about it?
All right, Jenna, let's talk a little bit about the research design. how do you make sure you have reliable data?
Getting reliable data, that's a really good question. So there's kind of different ways that researchers can go about making sure their data are reliable. One of the most common ways, at least in my field, is to have multiple people look at your data. So when I do interviews for research, I like record those interviews, I transcribe them word for word, and I have someone else like listen to the recording and match them up to make sure that yes, I have indeed like just transcribed this word for word, like every single word that the participant said is in my transcript. So there's reliability check there. I go through and I read all of the interviews. Typically, this is like a research team. So, like a couple people would go through the interviews, look for themes or kind of common things that are talked about from multiple participants. Then you write definitions for those themes and have people that were not involved in the developing the theme process check that. And so there's always kind of this person who is part of the research team, but not part of this exact piece of the research that does a check to make sure that, like, yes, they also agree that quote X matches theme Y. Right? And so there's just like multiple checks in this process to make sure that how I interpret the data with my knowledge is also how you interpret the data with your different set of knowledge, because ideally, like the data are what they are. And so, like, if you have multiple people saying, yes, we think that this matches, then you just have more trustworthiness, you have more confidence that your data are saying what you think that they're saying. And so that's one way, kind of within the paper or within the study, that you can get reliable data.
If I could just it sounds
Yeah,
like it's important for the researcher and for the results that they're not interpreted solely through the lens of the researcher, that it's there's so many checks along the way to make sure that yes, this is what the person said, and yes, this does match with that's I didn't know that. That's incredible.
yeah. It's not just one person who looks at the data. There's multiple people who look at it and come to a consensus on what it means. Yeah, kind of like within a project. And then outside of the project, like once I have data, I've written it up in one of these research papers that hopefully isn't too hard to read. I try to make them, I try to like write them so that they're easier to digest. So, once I put up all of that data in a paper, then I submit it to a peer-reviewed journal, and the editor of that journal finds at least two other faculty or other researchers in my area. It could be up to five, but it's usually two or three. Finds other experts in my area and asks them to review my paper. And what they're doing is they're making sure that I have followed all the ethical protocols, my research method makes sense, and that it's a scientifically sound study, that the data are reliable to the best knowledge of the person reading the paper, that my conclusions are in line with the type of data that I've gathered, right? So there's kind of experts in the field who critique papers to make sure that, like, yes, this paper also makes sense. And if it doesn't meet the quality standards, it's rejected. They say, nope, like this, you cannot submit this here. You need to find a different journal. You need to revise this to such an extent that we won't accept a revision, right? So there's kind of that possible outcome. Or there's the outcome of, okay, like the bones of this paper are really good, but in order to replicate it, we need information on X, Y, and Z. And so you need to revise your paper, resubmit it for us to look at it to see if it now meets the standards. And so, that process kind of happens usually a couple times before a paper is actually published in a peer-reviewed journal.
That
So that's kind
sounds
of,
really stressful.
it can be.
I
If,
mean, you're almost preparing for possible rejection
oh, yes.
or just
Yeah. Yeah, because it's something that you usually believe like a lot in, that you put your heart and soul into, and sometimes it gets rejected, and that's just the way it is.
But is that sort of everybody responds to feedback differently. Of course, we know that in our relationship with our students, but how do you take that? If I could just ask a personal question.
Yeah, yeah, of course. Um, the vast majority of the time, the feedback is very, very constructive, because the peer reviewers who are looking at your paper, especially if they see the value of what you're doing, if it's something new, something different, something that has like a different kind of take on what's been done before, if they see it as having a lot of value, like they also want to help it get published. They want to make it the best paper it can be. And so, the feedback that you get really does help your paper get there. Because like, I'm one researcher, I have one set of opinions, I write a certain way, like I include certain details, but things are always much better when you have outside input, and getting that outside input just makes my studies that have been published stronger. And so like the vast majority of the time it makes the papers a lot stronger. In as a researcher we also have like this joke of reviewer two who's just always unhappy regardless of what you submit. But that doesn't happen very often. Like almost always, it's a very good critical critique to make the paper better.
That's great perspective. It's great perspective. So you talked a little bit earlier about the purpose of research is to improve lives. In education, special education, of course, Partners in Promise cares a lot about special education. We talk a lot about educational outcomes of our kids. So can you talk a little bit about the outcomes of research?
Yeah. So, the purpose or the outcomes of research are to really improve the lives of individuals. And so, like that kind of has a different take or different flavor depending on what area of research you work in, what field, what topic you do. But ultimately, like the goal of all research is to improve the human experience in one way or another. Sometimes that's achieved through learning more about like this tiny little microorganism that does XYZ in your body. And sometimes that's achieved by learning about what is the experience of like military families who have children with autism, and how can we like what are some supports that they would recommend. Right. So it's kind of different depending on what field you work in. But the ultimate goal of researchers and of research in general is to make life better.
Here's a burning question. Do you get paid for research or publishing?
That's a good question. No. um, so, researchers who are faculty members get paid a salary, just like other people who make salary, right? And so, we say in faculty world and academia that there's three buckets that faculty members are responsible for, and our salary covers our time for those three buckets. One of those is teaching, and the amount of courses you teach varies by institution. One of those is research. So, like my salary, part of my salary helps pay for my time to do research. And then service. So, service to the departments, things like admission committees, service to the university, things like assessment boards, and service to the community. And so, there's kind of like these three main jobs that faculty have. So, my salary covers my time to do research, but I don't get paid for an article that I publish. I don't get paid a bonus. I don't get paid to find certain conclusions. I don't get paid when people cite my work. I don't get royalties or anything like that. In a lot of fields, researchers actually pay to have their paper published. Like once your paper gets accepted, there's like a publication fee that the professor has to pay or the school has to pay, as like a way to help the journal cover the cost of um, like finding the peer reviewers or making it open access. That's another thing that a researcher would pay. So if you want to make your paper what's called open access, so available to anybody instead of just those who have a journal subscription, you actually pay as the researcher to have that be the case. And so, yeah, researchers don't earn extra money for things that we publish. We don't have royalties or things like that. No.
And I should also point out that we Partners and Promises and all volunteer staff, and so you are
Yes.
also not getting paid to help
No.
Partners and Promise, but you have our adoration and unending love, of course. Um, Ultimately, it sounds like researchers get paid to be curious,
Yes.
and
Yes.
that's really powerful. You're not, I mean, you said it, you're not paid to reach a conclusion. It sounds just from what I've heard in the last few years of the conversations in the research teams is what is the data telling us?
Hmm.
That that is how we drive our recommendations. That's how we drive our programming is, what do families need? So here's a question for you, Jenna. When parents, military parents with children with autism, when we are scouring the internet for research, what can help us decipher what to read?
Yeah, this is a really good question because there's so much out there, so much information. Some of it is great, and some of it is on like the not so great side of the spectrum. And this is actually something that I have my students do in the autism class that I teach, is I have them look up interventions and try to find an autism intervention that they believe is real and try to find one that they believe is not real, like does not have real outcomes, and potentially has harmful outcomes, and compare the two. And so, what I would recommend for parents is that something you can look at is the author of whatever you find. So, who is the person who wrote this piece? Is it someone who has qualifications on the topic? So, is it someone who like has qualifications, training, experience, just information about this topic that the general public would not have? If that's not the case, then it's very likely that that person is missing some of the nuance, some of like the intricacies, the ins and outs of whatever you're trying to find information on. So I encourage parents and my students to look at the author. I also encourage them to look at the source. So is the source of what you're finding a peer-reviewed journal article, in which case that's really good information. And if it's not, is it something that you can do a check on? Like, can you check to see, have multiple people kind of found the same thing? Is there consensus with what this topic, what this source is saying? Because if there's not, it could just be someone who is pretending to be a researcher and writes a paper that kind of looks like it could be a research article, but really it's just their opinion, right? So you kind of can look at the source. Another really big takeaway and thing to look at is the wording of whatever you're finding. Research, the wording of research tends to be very direct. It's not emotional. It comes off as very like factual and just like here's what the data say, right? Um, if what you have found is overly emotional or sensational, if it's trying to persuade you to do something, to not to do something, that's kind of like a red flag that I encourage my students and parents I've talked to think about, because researchers, even if they're not writing for a peer-reviewed article, if they are writing like a blog that can be more easily digested, recognize that their studies are just one brick in this building that I talked about, like to make change, right? And so the language of researchers tends to be much more measured, than someone who's trying to convince you to do something. Like the researchers aren't typically out to like scare you to do something. They want to provide just the facts, and so the language tends to be more measured. If something comes across as being like too good to be true or solves like many problems, like it probably is too good to be true. And you probably want to like look at other sources to see, have multiple people found this same thing, or is it just this one dude like making this blog? um
I think that's really good for parents, especially because autism encompasses so many challenges for the kids and the
mhm,
families. that it really appeals to the emotional needs and the stress needs of the parents as this can help, this can solve, this can fix.
Mhm.
That's appealing, but I appreciate how you worded that as like if it's trying to persuade, then question the purpose or the intent, I guess, of the article.
Yeah, for sure. And that doesn't necessarily mean that, everything that has emotional language is incorrect. It just means that it should like, shoot up a red flag of this seems a little fishy. Like I need to do some more investigation on this to see if there's other sources that would say the same thing. Because again, like researchers tend to have language that is much more measured and level.
All right, last two questions. How did you get involved in PIP?
Yes. So, after doing my initial research projects as a graduate student, like the interview and the survey and some intervention studies with military families, I felt it was really important to partner with military families because, like, yes, I have the research experience and I have like this depth of knowledge about your experience, for example, like based on the research that I've done, but I'm not part of that community. Like I'm not a military spouse. I don't have a child with autism. And so there's a lot of nuance there that I can't possibly understand just because I'm not part of that community. I don't have that same experience. And so I really felt that it was important to find like an organization that was focused on military families with children with special needs to make sure that their voices were heard in this research. Because like, yeah, like I can see as a researcher, there's a need there, but I also want to make sure that whatever is being done, really reflects what this population feels they need. And the only way to do that is to like collaborate and be partners in research. And so I kind of went to Dr. Google, as one does, to see like are there any organizations out there who are interested in helping military families with children with special needs, and are they doing research or are they interested in like learning more through a scientifically designed study? And Partners in Promise was that organization.
You sure are.
So it was just it was good timing. It was a good fit for the research that I do, but also for the goals that Partners in Promise has of trying to like make policy recommendations and make changes based on data, and making sure that that data is scientifically and ethically sound, which is part of my job as the volunteer lead researcher for Partners in Promise.
Yes. We are so thankful that you were here. All right, last and final question. What are you doing now?
Well, with Partners in Promise, we are working on our 2025 survey, which will be released in September. And as I mentioned, part of my responsibility as the lead researcher is to make sure that this 2025 survey meets the requirements for a well-designed survey. So making sure that it's like the data that we're getting is scientifically accurate, that it's very carefully planned, that it would be able to be published in a peer-reviewed journal, right? So making sure that it's good, solid data so that we can then use that data to support recommendations for policy, legislation, to support changes in practice for educators or therapists or whatever kind of we end up finding from the data, to just make sure that we have the best data to make the best recommendations. And so that's what we've been working on. We are also making sure that not only is the design and the data scientifically sound, but making sure it's also ethically sound. So going through and making sure we have protections for anyone who takes the survey, making sure it's anonymous, making sure that there's protocols in place for if there's any what's called identifying information. So if anyone adds in like the name of their child or the name of themselves or something in an open-ended question, that we take that data out, so that no one can trace any particular response to any individual person. That's something that's really important in kind of the ethics of research is making sure that people stay anonymous. And so that's another thing that I'm assisting with, is to make sure that we have protocols in place to help people stay anonymous. And so, yeah, that's what we're working on.
And I appreciate that because one of the challenges Pip has had previously is like some families don't, they very much worry about, well, if I say anything negative, this can get traced back to me. And so I appreciate you explaining to our PIP audience that there are many, many measures in place to make sure that that does not happen, so that each and every respondent's private or any information that is shared is protected and it remains private and it is not shared externally. So thank you so much for sharing that. I am thrilled that you took so much time to be here with me today. Thank you so much. The last 2 points that I want to make is, just as Dr. Kremkow said, the goal of research is to make life better for people. And secondly, I wanted this webinar to take the idea of research and to put it in an easily digestible framework. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you to the PIP audience. I hope you enjoyed.